The Russian army is suffering heavy losses against the Ukrainian forces, which are getting stronger every day. New developments in the regions where the war is raging reveal the losses of the Russian army. One of these developments took place recently in the city of Kadiyevka in Luhansk Oblast. Russian invaders were stunned by an unexpected attack. The Russian army is using some factories and shops in the occupied territories as ammunition depots, assembly areas, hospitals, and bases. The Ukrainian army can easily detect these temporary locations used by the Russian occupiers, thanks to powerful systems such as unmanned aerial vehicles and the successful work of intelligence units. In addition, U.S. intelligence also shares information and location with Ukraine. Thanks to this strong structure, the Ukrainian army continues to blow up the bases of Russian soldiers every day. Recently, the Ukrainian army blew up a Russian base in the city of Kadiyevka and a field hospital used by the invaders. The Ukrainian Military Strategic Communications Directorate announced that the destroyed hospital was a former machine-building factory. It was stated that Chechen soldiers loyal to Chechen leader Kadyrov were in this hospital. In a telegram post, the Ukrainian armed forces said the former dispensary of a machine-building plant were struck with high-precision weapons. The Ukrainian army destroyed the former machine-building plant used as a base and hospital by the Russian occupiers with American-made HIMARS missiles. In the images shown on social media, it is seen that the building has been leveled to the ground. It is claimed that over 100 pro-occupation Chechen soldiers were killed in this attack. The Ukrainian army continues to make history against the Russian invaders in Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, where the war is raging. Immediately after the base and the hospital of the Russian invaders in the Husk was blown up, there was a new development in Donetsk Oblast. The Ukrainian Air Force shot down 3 Russian helicopters in 30 minutes in the city of Yevgeny in the Volkhov region. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine announced that it shot down 3 Russian Ka-52 attack helicopters and 1 Russian Su-25 aircraft in a 30-minute period known as the most advanced attack helicopter. The Ka-52 attack helicopter can be used in all weather conditions and can successfully hit many targets, including low-speed air targets and military personnel. Russia's loss of these helicopters would mean a major setback in the war. Ukrainian forces have destroyed nearly 300 helicopters belonging to the Russian army since the beginning of the invasion. The General Staff of the Ukrainian Army recently published a report on the fighting in the Zaporizhia region. In this report, it announced the destruction of the Tiger vehicle of the Russian troops, among many other achievements in the war zone. In addition, it was stated that the Russian occupiers suffered hundreds of casualties in Kherson, which is located right next to the Zaporizhia region. It was stated that local hospitals in Kherson are full of wounded Russian occupiers, and some of these wounded were sent to Crimea for treatment. In the published report, the losses of the Russian occupiers in Zaporizhia were mentioned as follows. According to the clarified data, as a result of the combat with the Defense Force units, the loss of the invaders in this period amounted to more than 50 people. In addition, 9 units of weapons and military equipment of different types were destroyed, tank 6 BMP units and an armored car Tiger. Another 4 units have been damaged. The Russian army continues to lose against Ukraine. Here is what the Russian army lost during the occupation. Over 125,000 military personnel, about 3,200 tanks and 6,400 armored combat vehicles, over 2,000 artillery systems, over 450 reactive volley fire systems, about 250 air defense systems, 300 aircraft and 300 helicopters, over 5,000 tanks and automotive equipment, about 20 military ships and boats, over 790 cruise missiles, about 2,000 unmanned aerial vehicles, 200 special machines, and 4 operational tactile missile complexes. The Russian army can no longer hide the fact that it is not succeeding in the war with its losses. One of the biggest reasons for the failure of the army is the unwillingness of the soldiers to fight and the lack of experienced soldiers in the army. Unable to find soldiers to deploy in the occupied territories, Putin has weakened the army with a series of wrong decisions. Sending in mercenaries like the Wagner Group and prisoners released from jail to the front lines has created many problems with the Russian army itself. Putin's declaration of compulsory mobilization has also led to the recruitment of reluctant soldiers. A video shared recently reveals the incompetence of Russian soldiers as the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense made fun of Russian soldiers with a video shared on social media. The video shows Russian soldiers sitting on a military vehicle and a tank in motion. The operator of the moving tank is moving back and forth pointlessly. The tank operator clumsily approaches the other vehicle. The soldiers on the vehicle are caught in the tank barrel and fall to the ground. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense posted this video with comedy, music and laughter with the following comments. The biggest threat to mobilized Russian infantry are mobilized. Russian tank man. The Russian army has as much of a problem with inadequate ammunition as it does with recruits. Since the beginning of the war, the Russian army has been losing around 500 soldiers a day and continues to lose tons of ammunition, almost all of the missiles of the Russian army targeting Ukrainian territory are destroyed by the success of the Ukrainian Air Force. Ukraine is getting stronger day by day in the field of air defense systems with the support of Western and European countries. Recently, an Estonian intelligence official made a statement about Russia's decreasing ammunition. In the statement, it was stated that Russia's major attacks against Ukraine are now limited. He stated that the Russian army is only in a position to carry out a major attack for 3 months with the stock it has. Russia has now lost against Ukraine because what is happening in the occupied territories reveals this fact. Although Russian leader Putin is trying hard not to admit defeat, he is not succeeding. Putin is trying to continue the occupation with many different plans such as mobilization declarations, negotiations with friendly countries, bans imposed within the country. But these plans do not work as he wants. It seems that Russia, which is losing hundreds of military personnel and tons of ammunition every day, will not be able to continue the occupation. Do you think Putin will give up his decision to invade? What will the Russian army do in the face of these heavy losses? How do you evaluate the successful operations of the Ukrainian army? Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky stated that he and his military leaders plan to maintain their presence in Bakhmut and hold the city despite the ongoing Russian aggression. Ukrainian forces face both regular Russian army forces and prisoners gathered by Wagner Special Military Group and filling their trenches in droves. There were intense clashes between the two as a result of these conflicts. Casualties were, of course, inevitable. However, the Kremlin administration is not releasing official casualty figures for Bakhmut or elsewhere. Although official casualties were not disclosed, the most abandoned city turned into a cemetery. The Russian army has lost thousands of men in Bakhmut in recent weeks. Most of these men were private soldiers working for the controversial Wagner Group. For every kilometer of land captured around the city of Bakhmut, hundreds of Russian soldiers were eliminated. Western officials say 30,000 Russian soldiers have been killed in the fighting for the Ukrainian city of Bakhmut since it began last summer. Officials add that the epic nature of the war was disproportionate to Bakhmut's strategic importance. Also, one official stated that for Ukraine, the Bakhmut war was a unique opportunity to neutralize many Russians. Although Western officials announced Russian losses, the Kremlin vehemently denied them. In a statement at a defense meeting published on Telegram, Sergei Shoigu stated that Ukraine lost 11,000 soldiers in just one day. Shoigu perhaps deliberately reversed Ukraine's criticism of Moscow's own human wave tactics. Sergei Shoigu said that the indifference of the Kiev regime towards its own people is surprising. As a result, the Ukrainian armed forces managed to corner 30,000 Russian soldiers in Bakhmut. About 180,000 Russian soldiers died on the front lines, including the casualties at Bakhmut. Still, the Russian forces are trying to advance in this small city despite the casualties. The Russian Ministry of Defense is strengthening the area, possibly with more troops, including elite VDV airborne forces. The Ukrainian army is fortifying the area to prevent the town from being taken over. Beyond Bakhmut, the conflict tunnel and continues with no significant change in territorial control on either side. Combat reverted to the familiar patterns of static lines, small-scale attacks, and multiple artillery fire. As a matter of fact, both Ukrainian and Russian forces use artillery heavily to corrupt the opposing side and damage its reputation. Artillery continues to be responsible for the most casualties. There is very little maneuvering on the ground at the moment. However, that will change as Ukrainian forces counterattack in the coming weeks. The United States and the West are increasing their support for Ukraine so that the counterattack can be as successful as possible. In addition, the fighters of the armed forces of Ukraine carried out a series of successful counterattacks in the Donetsk direction. Kiev troops forced the Russian army to retreat from some positions. Currently, the Ukrainian army has positioned itself on new frontiers and is fortifying them for further defensive action. This was announced by Colonel Alexei Dmitrievsky, spokesman for the Joint Press Center of the Defense Forces of the Tavria direction. It was stated that the Russian army tried to attack the Stoptavdiivka, Marinka and Kurlivka settlements again the other day. Russian attacks were thwarted by Ukrainian artillery with effective artillery fire. The Russian forces suffered significant losses. Russian forces had to retreat as a result of their losses. On the other hand, statistics were also given that the Russians carried out 30 attacks, 10 of which were at night in the last 24 hours, with no results. Only one of these attacks was reinforced by 2 unit tanks. Using 2 tanks for only 1 attack out of 30 attacks is quite meaningful. This is the most concrete example of recent Russian tank losses. In order to better understand the Russian tank losses, it's useful to remember the breathtaking points in Avdiivka. As it is known, Russia focused its efforts on besieging Avdiivka, a town in eastern Ukraine. Avdiivka, about 136 kilometers south of Bakhmut, became the focus of Russian forces. Russian troops' gains in the region were limited and progress was slow and costly. Vladimir Putin's army made only marginal progress in the offensive in the Donetsk province at the expense of heavy losses in armored vehicles. The Russian military leadership has deployed some Kremlin-backed private mercenary Wagner Group elements in this area to reinforce their last limited advance in the city. The 10th Tank Regiment probably lost most of its tanks while trying to encircle Avdiivka from the south. The losses of the 10th Tank Regiment are most likely due to tactically flawed frontal attacks similar to those in recently unsuccessful Russian armored attacks such as around the town of Volodar. The mechanized infantry, together with the tanks, forms the core of the armored units as the combat effectiveness of tank units not supported by mechanized infantry decreases. Tank losses increase because although the tank is very strong, it is a vehicle that also has weaknesses. Mechanized infantry guards the weak sides of the tanks, watches their flanks and rear, destroys anti-tank guns and tank destroyers in places that restrict the view and movement of tanks, such as in densely forested areas. Mechanized infantry units provide tanks with both close protection and situational awareness. If the infantry fails to fulfill these duties, it is considered tactically defective. As a result of this defeat, serious problems such as losing a tank occur. This is how we can summarize the general problem in the Russian army. After the tank losses in Avdiivka, Belohorivka near the Donetsk Oblast is another region where the Russian army suffered tank losses. A 31-second video posted on social media captured the moment when a Russian BMP-1 infantry fighting vehicle was targeted by anti-tank guided missiles near the village of Belohorivka. Ukraine's 10th Mountain Assault Brigade neutralized the IFV while advancing over open terrain. The Russian BMP-1 appeared to have stopped with absolutely no cover. When the atom hit it, an explosion engulfed the IFV, which was left on the field as a burning hulk. There were no survivors from the vehicle. In summary, Ukrainian forces continued to hunt both Russian soldiers and Russian tanks on land with successful offensive operations. Ukrainian artillery and missile units are destroying Russian headquarters and important supply lines. It is frequently used on the front lines with Ukrainian anti-tank missiles. As winter turns to spring in 19th century Europe, this is how war is waged for Bakhmut. A 19th century weapon still slays men in Black Ukraine. Now the small town of Bakhmut in Donbass is a wasteland of shattered buildings and trees. However, both sides are determined to fight fiercely for this land. The understanding is that the war will continue. Russia seems determined to lose hundreds of thousands of lives in the long run. The most important European conflict since the end of the Second World War looks set to continue for a while. Thanks you for watching us. The Ukrainian forces will make a gain by liberating Crimea from the invasion initiated by Russia. Ukrainian forces and volunteers want to advance towards the Great Crimea target, colliding with Russian forces in the Kherson area. However, great care must be taken as the region was formerly under the control of Russian forces. Russian forces mined heavily on the east bank of the Dnipro River in Kherson Oblast. Ukrainian Kherson Oblast management consultant Serhiy Klan reported. At the same time, Russian forces increased their fortifications in Kherson and various spots of Crimea in order to prevent the attacks of Ukrainian forces on Crimea. As Ukrainian forces become stronger in the Kherson region, they pose a greater threat to Crimea, inversely proportional to the strengthening of the Ukrainian forces. The Russian forces in Crimea are weakening. Recently, as Russian forces sought victory in eastern Ukraine, Ukrainian forces made an excellent defense on the one hand and launched serious attacks on military bases and supply routes in Crimea on the other. As a result of these attacks, the Russian forces in Crimea evacuated the military bases in order not to be affected by the attacks of the Ukrainian forces. At the same time, the Russian-backed administration in Crimea started to work to transfer the people of Crimea to Russian lands. Although the majority of them fled to Russia after the start of the war, the number of Russian citizens remaining in Crimea is still substantial. The Kerch-Bosphorus Bridge, which became unusable after a Ukrainian attack, both prevented the Russian army from gaining strength, and Russian citizens had to choose a more dangerous route to escape or have to wait for long ferry lines. This situation poses a great danger to the Russian citizens in Crimea. In the war, that is not clear at any moment, former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev warned last month of nuclear retaliation if Ukraine tries to seize the Crimean Peninsula. The recapture of Crimea by Ukrainian forces would be a great embarrassment to the Russian forces. Crimea, with its great advantage to the Russian army, has become the red line of the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin. Moscow has made it clear that it views any large-scale attack on Crimea as an existential threat to Russia itself. Since the beginning of the war, the Russian leader has threatened the whole world, saying that he has the right to use nuclear weapons after attacks on Russian soil. Ukrainian forces have launched attacks on areas in Russia and in Crimea that support the Russia-Ukraine war, although they do not fully admit it. But after any of these attacks, Russia did not use nuclear weapons. Russia's lack of enthusiasm for nuclear weapons has emboldened Ukrainian forces and Ukraine's Western partners. This courage led the Ukrainian forces to take more concrete steps to liberate Crimea. When Russia's stance on nuclear became soft, Western countries increased their support for Ukraine. Any attempt to end the occupation of Crimea will likely result in the real strength of international support for Ukraine. Reign being revealed. Ever since the full-scale Russian invasion began, the Crimean question has become a litmus paper for Ukraine's Western partners. It will be revealed whether Western countries are really trying to deny that Ukraine won the war or simply to deny Putin's victory as the Russian occupation leaves its 15th month behind. The military situation reveals that neither side has a decisive advantage. Front lines in southern and eastern Ukraine. Almost no large-scale military action has occurred since the liberation of Kherson in November 2022. However, if we take this situation into account and say that the struggle has reached a dead end in the last 6 months, we would be extremely wrong. During this period, there was great activity on all fronts of the war. Most of Russia's professional army was destroyed in the first 8 months of the occupation. The Russian army was supported by the arrival of newly mobilized troops. However, these fresh recruits have limited training and often substandard equipment. Although his army was strengthened by mobilized soldiers, Russia suffered heavy losses during the crushing winter offensive. The wrong war strategy of the Russian forces caused a great increase in the number of casualties. Russian soldiers confirmed their large number of casualties, with online videos of them complaining about the high death toll and dissatisfaction in the winter period.